The road twisted like a dying snake, empty and silent. A thick fog swallowed everything, creeping over the cracked pavement and hiding what lay ahead. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, but felt deep in the bones. There were no birds, no rustling trees, no sign of life, only the sound of footsteps echoing too loudly. A man named Daniel moved forward, his breath shallow. His car had broken down miles back, the engine dying without warning. He had no choice but to walk. The map showed a town nearby, Silent Hill. It was the only place around. Something was wrong. Every step deeper into the fog made the silence worse. The town's entrance appeared like a ghost rising from a mist. A broken welcome sign leaned to one side, covered in scratches. The words were barely readable. "Welcome to Silent Hill." Daniel hesitated. The town was empty. Buildings stood like abandoned shells, windows shattered, doors hanging open. The streets were cracked, and old cars sat frozen in place, rust eating their bodies. A thick smell of something rotting filled the air. It wasn't just decay, it was something worse. He moved forward. His shoes scraped against the pavement, and the sound felt too loud, like he wasn't supposed to be here. Shadows stretched in strange ways. Buildings that seemed close shifted when he looked away. The roads behind him looked different than before, twisting in ways they shouldn't. He passed an old diner. The neon sign buzzed weakly, the letters flickering. Eddie's Dine Dash, the last letter, had burned out. The door stood open. Inside, the air was stale. Tables were overturned, plates broken on the floor. A thick red stain smeared across the counter. He stepped closer. His fingers brushed against it. It was dry, old. Then a sound. A soft scrape. Daniel spun around. The diner was empty. The fog outside pressed against the windows, making it impossible to see beyond. He stood still, listening. Another scrape. Closer. His breath caught. His heart pounded. Something was in here with him. Then a whisper. Faint. A voice right behind him. Daniel's muscles locked. Cold breath brushed the back of his neck. He turned slowly. No one was there. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The air in the diner felt heavier, pressing against his skin. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then a chair moved. It scraped across the floor, sudden and sharp. Daniel stumbled back, eyes wide. The chair had moved on its own. His breathing was ragged now. He backed toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming to leave. But as he turned, the doorway was gone. The diner had changed. The walls had darkened, turning into cracked, rotting wood. The windows were now covered in grime, blocking out the outside world. The buzzing neon light was dead. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't right. A sound came from the kitchen. A deep, wet breathing. Something was back there. Something was waiting. He needed to get out. His feet barely made a sound as he moved toward the counter, searching for something, anything, to defend himself. His fingers wrapped around a rusted knife, its blade dull but solid. He gripped it tight. The breathing grew louder. Then a low growl. A shape moved in the darkness beyond the kitchen door. Daniel's pulse raced. He took a step back. The door slammed open. A figure crawled out. Twisted, wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in jagged, broken nails. Its face was a blur, shifting like a flickering image, never staying in one shape. Its breath was thick and ragged, its chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Then it screamed. Daniel ran. He didn't look back. His legs burned as he sprinted toward the farthest wall, praying for a door, a window, anything to escape. His fingers smashed against the cold surface. He pushed, hit, desperate. Then, suddenly, a door appeared. He didn't stop to question it. He yanked it open and dove through. Darkness swallowed him whole. Daniel hit the ground hard. His hands scraped against rough concrete, his knees slamming into the cold surface. He gasped, pain shooting through his body, but he didn't stop moving. He scrambled forward, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. Silence. The diner was gone. The air around him was thick, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. The fog curled in from all sides, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. His fingers trembled as he pushed himself up, his pulse hammering in his ears. Where was he? The street looked different. The buildings were taller, leaning over him as if they were watching. The windows were black, empty, like deep holes leading into nothing. The road beneath him was cracked, pieces missing, revealing an abyss below. He turned, looking for the diner. But there was nothing behind him. No doorway. No sign he had ever been there. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A deep sound rumbled in the distance. A siren. Low, eerie, stretching through the fog like a warning. Then the air shifted. The buildings changed. Their walls blackened, the bricks twisting into something unnatural. The street beneath his feet melted into rusted metal, the cracks widening into deep, endless voids. The sky above darkened, the fog turning into thick ash falling like dead snow. The world around him was rotting. Daniel took a step back, his heart hammering. His skin prickled with the feeling that he wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Down the street, something moved. A shape, tall, hunched. Its skin was raw, torn in places, its limbs too long, its fingers curling in sharp, unnatural angles. Its face was hidden beneath a rusted metal helmet, its breathing deep and inhuman. Daniel froze. The creature lifted its head. Then it charged. Daniel's body reacted before his mind did. He spun, running. His legs burned, his breath came in gasps, but he didn't dare stop. The sound of heavy footsteps pounded behind him. The air filled with a grinding screech of metal. A narrow alley appeared to his right. A way out. He threw himself into it, his shoulder slamming against the wall as he stumbled forward. The passage was tight, the walls on either side covered in old, peeling paint. His footsteps echoed, loud and sharp. The alley suddenly ended. A dead end. Daniel's chest tightened. He turned, heart racing, eyes darting for a way to climb, anything to escape. The metal walls loomed over him, impossible to scale. Then silence. The footsteps had stopped. Daniel swallowed, his hands shaking. The alley was empty. No creature. No sound. He took a slow step forward. His breath came in shallow gasps. He peered around the corner. Nothing. Had it been real? Was his mind playing tricks on him? Then a shadow stretched across the wall. A low, rattling breath filled the alley. Daniel's stomach dropped. He turned his head slowly, dread crawling up his spine. The creature was right behind him. Its helmet tilted slightly, as if it was watching him, studying him. The long, rusted blade in its hand scraped against the ground, leaving deep gashes in the metal. Its breath was slow, deliberate. Daniel couldn't move. The air was thick with the smell of blood and rust. Then, without warning, the blade swung. Daniel barely ducked in time. The force of the swing slammed into the wall, sending sparks flying. The sound was deafening, metal shrieking against metal. Daniel didn't think. He ran. His feet pounded against the rusted ground, his breath ragged. The alley twisted and turned, the walls closing in, but he didn't stop. Then a door. It stood at the end of the path, half open, leading into darkness. Daniel didn't hesitate. He threw himself inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence returned. His breath came in heavy gasps. He turned, pressing his back against the cold surface. His hands trembled. His entire body shook. The creature didn't follow. The room around him was pitch black. The air was thick, damp. The floor beneath his feet felt uneven, like old wood, soft in places, rotting. He wasn't safe. A single light flickered to life, dim and yellow. The room was small. Rusted pipes lined the walls, dripping dark liquid onto the floor. An old metal table stood in the center, covered in stains. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly. A sound. A whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Daniel's breath caught. He turned too fast, too scared, and came face to face with something standing in the dark. The light flickered and then went out. Darkness swallowed Daniel whole, pressing against his skin like a second layer of flesh. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, loud and uneven, like a drum beating in the void. His breath came in slow, shaky gasps, but he didn't dare make a sound. The air was thick, damp, and carried the heavy scent of rust and decay. The whisper had come from somewhere in the room, but now there was only silence, deep and absolute. He tried to move, reaching out blindly in the pitch-black space, but his fingers met only cold, damp air. The walls felt farther away than they should have been, stretching outward into nothingness, as if the room had no true shape. A part of him wanted to call out, to demand answers, but instinct kept him silent. Something was here, something unseen, something waiting. Then the sound returned, soft, slow breathing. It came from behind him, deep and uneven, like lungs that had never known clean air. Daniel's skin prickled, his muscles locking in place as he struggled not to react. Every nerve in his body screamed to run, to turn, to fight, but he was frozen, trapped in a moment where even blinking felt dangerous. The breath drew closer. Warm, rancid air brushed against his neck, thick with the stench of rotting meat. His stomach churned as he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, to resist the urge to recoil. His mind raced through every possible option, but nothing made sense. There was no escape, no light, no weapon in his hands, just the overwhelming presence of something unseen, something watching, something waiting. Then the whisper returned, closer this time. "You don't belong here." Daniel couldn't hold back. He stumbled forward, his hands searching frantically for anything solid to guide him, but the darkness remained endless, suffocating. His foot struck something metal, and he collapsed against a cold, rusted surface, his fingers scraping across rough, corroded edges. His breathing came too fast now, his chest rising and falling in uneven jerks, but the whispering had stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then light. A single bulb flickered to life above him, weak and yellow, casting jagged shadows across the room. Daniel's stomach twisted. The room was not the same. The rusted pipes remained, lining the cracked, mold-covered walls, but now the floor was slick with something dark, something thick that pooled in uneven patches. The chains hanging from the ceiling moved as if swayed by an unseen force, their rusted links clanking softly. And then he saw it. At the far end of the room stood a figure. It was tall, too tall, its body stretched unnaturally, its limbs long and thin like something starved. Its skin was pale, nearly gray, pulled too tight over its bones. The face, or what should have been a face, was missing. Instead, its head was wrapped in old, dirty bandages, stained with something deep and black. A long, jagged cut stretched across the fabric, revealing only darkness beneath. Daniel couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, slowly. Then it stepped forward. The chains above rattled. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward, the air thickening as if the entire space was suffocating him. His pulse hammered against his ribs, his mind screaming at him to move, but his body refused. Another step. The figure's limbs moved wrong, its joints bending too far, its fingers curling unnaturally, as if reaching for something unseen. Its body jerked with each motion, like a puppet controlled by something else, something unseen. The moment felt stretched, unbearable. Every inch of Daniel's body burned with the need to flee, but the figure was too close now. Then it spoke, but not in words. A deep, wet sound gurgled from its throat, low and uneven, as if it was trying to form speech, but had forgotten how. The noise slithered through the air, pressing against his ears, sending sharp waves of nausea through his stomach. His vision blurred at the edges, his mind struggling to hold onto reality, but the thing kept moving, closing the space between them inch by inch. Daniel snapped. His body finally obeyed, his muscles breaking free of their frozen terror. He turned, running. His feet slipped on the slick floor, but he forced himself forward, crashing into a rusted door at the far end of the room. His hands fumbled with the handle, slick with something wet, but he didn't care. He yanked, pulled, twisted, the door flung open. He tumbled through, falling into another corridor, slamming hard against the cold floor. His chest heaved as he pushed himself up, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely support his weight. His vision spun, his heart still racing. The door behind him, still open. He turned just in time to see the figure standing in the doorway. It didn't chase him. It didn't lunge. It just watched. The shadows around it twisted unnaturally, shifting like smoke, curling along the rusted edges of the doorframe. Its head tilted again, slow, deliberate. Then it raised its hand. Long, jagged fingers stretched outward, pointing directly at him. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. He scrambled back, forcing himself to his feet, stumbling down the corridor as fast as his legs would carry him. The dim light flickered above, barely illuminating the space ahead. He had no idea where he was, no sense of direction, but none of it mattered. He just needed to get away. The walls on either side of him were lined with old rusted lockers, their doors hanging open, some swaying slightly as he passed. The sound of metal creaking filled the air, a slow, rhythmic groan that seemed to follow him. His breathing was ragged, his limbs aching, but he didn't stop. Then the lights flickered again. Darkness swallowed the hall. Daniel skidded to a stop. The air changed. It became heavier, colder, pressing against him like something unseen had just filled the space around him. And then the lockers slammed shut. Every single one. The sound exploded through the corridor, metal doors crashing against rusted frames, the echoes bouncing off the walls like distant screams. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. His entire body locked in place as his breath hitched in his throat. Then, deep within the darkness, something moved. A slow, dragging sound, heavy and deliberate. Daniel knew, without seeing, that it was coming. Daniel could feel it. The weight of something unseen pressing against the air, the thick silence wrapping around him like a noose. The dragging sound grew closer, slow and deliberate, echoing through the pitch-black corridor. His breath came in short, panic bursts, his body frozen, every muscle locked in place, as if the very air around him had turned solid. He didn't want to look. He knew if he turned his head, if he dared to face whatever was lurking in the dark, it would be too late. But something inside him, some deep, primal instinct, forced him to move. His head turned. The darkness stretched deep, endless, but at the very edge of the flickering light, it appeared. A shape hunched, twitching, its body wrapped in torn, stained fabric that barely clung to its skeletal frame. Its skin, where it was visible, was raw, peeled away in strips, exposing dark muscle beneath. It moved with a slow, unnatural gait, its body jerking with every step, as if its bones didn't fit together properly. Then it stopped. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. The creature stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was listening. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then it moved fast. Too fast. One moment it was at the far end of the corridor. The next it was right there. Daniel stumbled back, his scream caught in his throat. He crashed into the cold metal lockers, the impact rattling through his bones. The creature was inches away now, its torn face twitching, a deep, rattling sound rising from within its chest. It reached for him. Daniel didn't think. He ran. He bolted down the corridor, his feet pounding against the rusted floor, the metal creaking beneath him. The air felt tighter, as if the very walls were closing in, squeezing him, forcing him forward. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, endless, twisting, the lights flickering above as if mocking him. Behind him, the creature followed. It didn't run. It didn't need to. It moved through the darkness, as if it was part of it. Daniel's chest burned, his lungs screaming for air, but he didn't dare stop. The corridor twisted sharply, and suddenly a door. He lunged for it, his fingers barely gripping the rusted handle before throwing himself inside. The door slammed shut behind him, the metal shuddering with the force of his impact. Silence. The room was small. A hospital room. Old, abandoned, the bed rusted, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper. A broken stand lay across the floor, long dried blood pooled in the cracks of the tiles. Daniel's breath came in heavy, uneven gasps. His hands shook as he pressed his back against the cold door, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Then a sound. Not behind him, not outside the door. Inside the room. Daniel's stomach twisted. Slowly, he turned his head. The bed was occupied. A figure lay beneath the thin, stained sheets. Its chest rose and fell in slow, uneven movements. The air around it was thick, heavy with something unseen. Then, its head turned toward him. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure's face was hidden beneath layers of bandages, old and yellowed with time, but the shape beneath was wrong, sunken, hollow. Then it whispered, "You were never supposed to leave." Daniel's entire body locked in place. His blood turned cold. The air around him shifted. The room changed. The walls darkened, the ceiling cracked, deep shadows crawling across the surface like living veins. The bed disappeared, replaced with something older, something worse, a gurney. Daniel's breath hitched. He had seen this room before. This was where he had died. Memories came rushing back, flashes of a hospital, doctors shouting, his own screams as he reached for something, someone. But he had never left. A deep sound rumbled through the room, the siren returning, low and hollow, vibrating through his bones. Daniel turned toward the door, his hands trembling as he reached for the handle. Locked. A sharp, cold whisper filled the room. "You can't escape what you are." Daniel turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was standing now, its bandaged face inches away from his own. The shadows swallowed the room whole. Then darkness. Nothingness. Then, slowly, the world returned. Daniel opened his eyes, his breath slow, steady. He was in a hospital bed. The air smelled of antiseptic, the faint beeping of a heart monitor echoing in the small, white-walled room. Sunlight streamed in through the half-open blinds. For a moment, everything was normal. Then he saw them. Figures standing at the foot of his bed, dressed in hospital gowns, their faces wrapped in bandages. All of them, their heads tilted, their empty eyes unseen beneath the fabric. Daniel's pulse spiked. His breathing turned shallow. Then one of them spoke. "Welcome back." The machines around him beeped wildly. The room darkened. The walls cracked. The shadows returned. Daniel screamed.